I think everybody can agree that as a sports fan, sometimes the things that are the most fun to talk about are historical debates, Hall of Fame discussions, who were the best, who were the worst, who was overrated, who was underrated, who's forgotten about, who you will never forget, all of that. So I thought it would be a fun thing for me to kind of do an all-time NFL mock draft. And what I mean is, with every pick in the first round, there's a total of 32 first round selections in this year's draft. I figured I would take each of the 32 picks and take a player from a past draft and say they were the best ever at that pick. They were the best player you could possibly get at that draft position, just to kind of see what it would look like. And you can look down below in the description box to see this mock draft, this pick 1 through pick 32. Now, it's kind of interesting as you go through history. Some of the players that are on there might have been picked like in the middle range, like between 10 and 20, but they might have been second round picks, let's say, or third round picks, what have you. It's just interesting. But I did it based off of the correlating number in terms of the player's draft position over the years. And below, you see the results. Now, to me, the first overall selection, the best number 1 overall choice of all time is Peyton Manning, the quarterback out of Tennessee, out of the class of 1998. And you've got a lot of great number 1 selections over the years, guys like Bruce Smith and John Elway, and I can go on and on and on. But I think the one that truly stands out a little bit above the rest, and trust me, this should mean something coming from me, somebody who is not a big Peyton Manning backer at all. I think it goes beyond saying that Peyton Manning is the greatest number 1 overall pick in the history of the NFL draft. The number 2 overall pick, Lawrence Taylor out of North Carolina, out of the class of 1981. I don't even think there is any discussion or is any debate. There have been some other really good number 2 picks over the years. Eric Dickerson out of SMU, the running back in the class of 1983, stands out to me. But at the end of the day, it would have to be LT. Now, as I went through this whole draft, there were certain picks that was just like, damn. A lot of them, frankly, was like, damn, this is a slam dunk. It's not even close. This would be the guy. It's kind of interesting when I looked at all 32 picks as well. The one pick that has no Hall of Famers, to the best of my recollection, the pick that has no Hall of Famers, again, I emphasize, is the 25th overall selection. The best player that I could see over the years that was drafted 25th overall was Ted Washington, the nose tackle out of Louisville, who was selected by the San Francisco 49ers in 1991. Now, you will see a couple of current players on this list. It shouldn't surprise you too much. Guys like Peyton Manning with the 1st overall selection, Adrian Peterson with the 7th overall selection, Drew Brees with the 32nd overall selection, and a guy at number 24, Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback out of Cal, selected by the Green Bay Packers at that slot in 2005. Some people might argue, what about Ed Reed in 2002? Are you going to take one of the better free safeties to play the game? Or are you going to take an elite, potentially first ballot Hall of Fame quarterback? I'm just saying, when in doubt, you're going to gravitate towards the quarterback. Now, as I went through this, like I said, there were some that just really stood out to me and some that were really easy to pick, but there were some tough choices. There were some really, really tough choices that, frankly, I was torn on. You look at picks number 3, number 5, number 6, number 19. Those would be some picks that really stood out to me in terms of, man, there's been a lot of really talented players and some very similar level players being drafted here. It's really hard to choose. It's almost a matter of personal preference. Now, with the 3rd overall selection, you might sit there and say, what type of Bear fan are you if you don't pick Dick Butkus, the linebacker out of Illinois from that class of 1965? Like I said, there's been some really good players chosen 3rd overall over the years. If I choose Dick Butkus, people are going to sit there and say, well, what about Barry Sanders, the running back out of Oklahoma State from the 1989 class? That great draft class where 4 guys in the top 5 ended up in the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton. Again, if somebody sat there and said Butkus should be the guy here at 3 or Sanders is the guy here at 3, I'm not going to argue. But I went with Anthony Munoz, the offensive lineman out of USC from the class of 1980. The significant thing to me about Munoz is the fact that he played, I think, like a total of maybe 16 games in his college career. So when Forrest Gregg and the Cincinnati Bengals took him 3rd overall in the 1980 draft, it was a tremendous gamble. This is the type of thing that in today's social media era, in today's internet era, in today's ESPN NFL Network era, this pick would be lampooned and lambasted. People would be calling for Forrest Gregg's head. They would be saying this team is the dumbest team in the history of the National Football League. How the hell are you going to take this guy 3rd overall? Well, Anthony Munoz, when you talk about him, you talk about a guy who is unquestionably viewed unanimously by people that know as the greatest left tackle in the history of the National Football League. Some people may argue that Butkus isn't the greatest linebacker of all time or middle linebacker of all time. Some people might argue that Barry Sanders isn't the best ball carrier of all time. But you almost get no argument, none whatsoever, from people that actually understand the history of football, know the history of football, and have seen enough football over the years to be able to make the determination. You get almost no complaints and no arguments about who the greatest left tackle of all time is, and that's Anthony Munoz. And I'll take the guy who was the best ever at his position over the other 2 great epic all-time Hall of Famers. You look at the 5th pick. And yes, most people will sit there and just say Deion Sanders, 5th overall out of Florida State, the defensive back from the 1989 class. And again, you're talking about perhaps the greatest man-to-man shutdown cover corner of all time. I'm not going to argue with you. But for my personal preference, I'm going to go a little more for the heartstrings here. And what I mean is one of my favorite players watching growing up, being a Bear fan and being somebody that has an appreciation for great linebacker play over the years, I go to the San Diego Chargers and their 5th overall selection out of the 1990 draft out of USC, and that's Junior Seau. I think it's a tragedy and a shame that he spent so many great years in San Diego where he got no attention. He spent so many years with an organization that played in a smaller market that people didn't really pay attention to him. And I don't think even if people knew the name and recognized the name, understood just how truly great a Junior Seau was. This, to me, is one of the great linebackers in the history of linebackers in the National Football League. And it is a tragedy and a shame, one, that he is unfortunately no longer with us. And it is almost as tragic that he doesn't get nearly the recognition or respect that he deserves for what he accomplished in his career. When I think about that 1994 Chargers AFC Championship team that went on to the Super Bowl to get cremated by Steve Young and the 49ers, I think about Junior Seau. I think about a man who was a leader. I think about a man who was a dominant player for over a decade. When people talk about Ray Lewis, I'll take Junior Seau. Personal preference perhaps, but he was dominant. He was a beast. So everybody else I always see, they say 5th overall, they take Deion Sanders. Not me. I'm taking Junior Seau. 6th overall, this would probably be the most controversial if there is one. Everybody, I'm sure, in their right mind would probably take Jim Brown, the running back out of Syracuse from the class of 1957. I, however, would not. I will take Sammy Baugh, the quarterback out of TCU from the 1937 class. And the reason being is Jim Brown was one of the all-time great players and one of the all-time great fullbacks and one of the all-time great ball carriers, but he really only played one position. Sammy Baugh, in his time, was like the Peyton Manning, the Ray Guy, and the Ed Reed. He was a Hall of Fame quarterback, a Hall of Fame punter, if you wanted to look at it that way, and a Hall of Fame safety as well. So he was the best, you could argue, at 3 different positions during his era in the National Football League. Now, again, you could sit there and say, well, he played in a league that was still mostly segregated, so he didn't have all the talent that he should have to face, and perhaps. But that doesn't stop Babe Ruth from being relatively unanimously viewed as the greatest, most dominant baseball player of all time, and it shouldn't be held against Sammy Baugh here. Sammy Baugh was a tremendous talent. He was a guy that really changed the game, and he was one of those great 60-minute players that impacted the game every chance he could. He impacted it as being the best quarterback of his time, the best free safety of his time, and arguably one of the greatest punters of all time. I'll take that versatility and I'll take that multi-positional dominance over the great dominance and great play of Jim Brown during his career. That's just me. And then I look at like number 19, Marvin Harrison, the wide receiver out of Syracuse from the class of 96. I could have sat there and went with John Mackey. You know, again, you're talking about John Mackey, one of the great tight ends at all time, really helped change the game along with Ditka during the 60s. You know, he was taken in the 19th overall selection in 63. I'll go with Marvin Harrison. I think he was a little more dominant for a longer period of time. But again, I won't knock anybody if they say I should have put John Mackey in there. Some of the interesting things you'll notice, there were a few drafts, a total of 7 of them, I believe, when I look back at it, that had multiple players in this all-time NFL mock draft, which speaks to the talent in those drafts: 1950, 56, 83, 1990, 1995, 96, and 98. Think about that for a second. That's a total of 7 of them that have multiple players here: 50, 56, 83, 90, 95, 96, and 98. Crazy thing about it is you have one draft by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 1995 that had 2 players taken for the same team. Not the only time you've ever seen it where 2 players are drafted at the same spot or by the same team in the same draft become Hall of Famers in the first round. See this 65 Bears draft with Butkus and Sayre. See the 96 draft with Ogden and Lewis for the Ravens. But, man, 95, the Bucks, Warren Sapp, Derrick Brooks. That changed an organization long-term for sure. Another interesting thing to point out here is you'll notice the positional breakdown. You had 6 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 4 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 3 offensive linemen, 6 defensive linemen, 5 linebackers, 3 defensive backs, and a punter. Some of you will sit there and say, you're going to put Ray Guy in there over Ozzie Newsome? Yes, Ray Guy was better at what he did than what Ozzie Newsome did. That's the way it is. Sorry. But another thing you find interesting is which college teams had the most players in this all-time first-round NFL mock draft. USC had the most with 4. Then you had, I got to look here at the list, Miami had 2, Oklahoma had 2, California had 2, Florida State had 2, and Purdue, of all people, had 2. Just think about that. Purdue had Rod Woodson, who clearly belongs at number 10, and then Drew Brees, who clearly belongs at number 32. Purdue had 2. Not in Alabama, not in Notre Dame, not in Michigan, not in Ohio State, not in Texas. So many big-time programs from over the years. And a Purdue had 2, and a California had 2. Just think about that. That's crazy. The craziest thing of all, though, when you look at this, is the team that had the most choices in this kind of all-time NFL mock draft. You had the Chargers with 2 of them with Seau and Brees. You had the Green Bay Packers with 2 of them. You had the New York Giants, the Buccaneers with 2 of them. You had the Baltimore/Indianapolis Colts with 3 of them. You had the San Francisco 49ers with 4 of them. But the team that had the most all-time selections based off of that individual position was the Minnesota Vikings with 5 of them. 5 of them. Think about that. You had Adrian Peterson 7th overall in 2007. You had Alan Page 15th overall in 1967. You had Randy Moss 21st overall in 1998. Just think about that again for a second. I forgot about Paul Krause, who went 18th overall in 1964. Fran Tarkenton, who went 29th overall in 1969. The Minnesota Vikings are the champions in terms of this all-time NFL mock draft, even over a great organization like the San Francisco 49ers, with their 5 out of the top 32 players of all time in terms of this all-time NFL mock draft. 5 guys. Think about that. Peterson, Page, Krause, Moss, Tarkenton. That was surprising to me. I thought it was going to be the 49ers or maybe it was going to be the Colts. But as I went through all 32 picks, I'm like, son of a bitch, wouldn't you know? It's the Minnesota Vikings. And each of those 5 picks really can't be argued. You look at the history of the NFL draft, you're not really going to argue with Tarkenton. You're not going to argue with Randy Moss. You're probably not going to argue with Paul Krause. You won't argue with Alan Page. And you probably won't argue with Adrian Peterson either. I just thought that was interesting. So those of you that understand and know the history of the NFL draft and the history of the National Football League, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoy looking at the all-time NFL mock draft down in the description box below. If you think you could do better, or if you got any gripes with anything that I said, let me know in the comments section down below. I welcome all spirited debate, even if you're wrong.